Novo dia. Mesmos papos, mesmas coisas, mesmos programas. Novo dia. Novo dia. Mesmos papos, mesmas coisas, mesmos programas, mesmos lugares, mesmos passeios. Novo dia. Mesmos papos, mesmas coisas, mesmos programas, mesmos lugares, mesmos passeios. Novo dia. Mesmos papos, mesmas coisas, mesmos programas, mesmos lugares, mesmos passeios. Novo dia. Mesmos papos, coisas, programas, lugares, passeios. Quer um roteiro diferente? O cinema brasileiro tem sempre um filme novo para você. Tem emoção para todos os gostos, para todos os públicos. Viva o cinema brasileiro!
Olá, boa tarde, bem-vindas.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to another BR Lab meeting, part of BR Plots, programming in partnership with ABRA to discuss narratives, scripts, Brazil's script market, writers market in Brazil and in the world. This activity is a joy to us, and it's very exciting because we have been discussing this topic in BR Plot for a few years. What is the what is the role of the showrunner, and why and how this role exists in the industry? And today we have an authority in the topic, Jeff Melvoin, who has been the showrunner of several shows and has created a showrunner course in the United States. And also, we are very joyful with this meeting. We are in joy with this meeting because we have great partners such as Especini, Projeto Paradiso, and also we have the partnership of ABRA and a very important partner, which is the Department of International Trade. Since last year, the Department of International Trade of the UK, and we are promoting this together with Media Exchange. And then Katrina will be here to tell us a bit of what is this program that they have, and also we promote certain activities to make the writers in Brazil and the UK come closer and develop business, and also just exchange ideas and experiences. And now I'm going to call our incredible partner, Vanessa Babala, to talk on behalf of the Department of International Trade of the UK. Welcome, Vanessa Babala. Thank you, Rafael. We are very excited to participate in the second consecutive year with you guys, and especially in such difficult times and doing such amazing work. So BR Lab, thank you for the space and opportunity. I'd like to thank our guests. It's an honor for us to offer this panel with the participation of Katrina Wood, Media Exchange, and Jeff Melvoin. Also, they will for sure present it better than I, but I just wanted to say and say a bit about what we do in the Department of International Trade, which is part of the British government that I work for. Our role basically is to try to promote business between the UK and Brazil. So through three fronts. The first one, which is through the institutional way to improve the most we can, the business environment. So we're very interested in listening to market barriers, bottlenecks, things that have impeded Brazilians and British to negotiate, to make deals. Another front is the trade front. So if a Brazilian production company is interested in finding a partner in the UK to produce, license, whatever, whether product or service, we are here as a role to help in our role to help free support, to offer free support to help with this business. And the third front is the support we provide Brazilian companies to become international. So if someone is interested in opening an office outside Brazil, and if you thought of doing that in the UK, come to us, contact us. We can help by helping with co-work space or trying to find a partner. So it's a very good proposal we offer. We always ask for the company to come to us so we can talk first of all and try to think of something to optimize things. So my contact will be accessible through the BR Lab organization. I can put it on the chat also to make things easier. But I think that's all I had to say for now, because who we actually want to listen to is our guests. So thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Vanessa. Fantastic. It's great to have DIT's partnership. And I'd like to thank also the entire BR Lab team, a wonderful production team, I can say. All the teams of different areas. This transmission today is being viewed in 2 links. It's a bit more complex because, as you can see, there is a link with simultaneous translation into Portuguese, another one with the original audio. Thank you for the technical team, the production team, the creators, and the BR Lab, BR Plot team. I'd like to ask Maíra Oliveira, Gustavo Gontijo, and also I would like to, in addition to Maíra and Gustavo, I would also like to ask Thiago Dottori, 3 people that I love a lot. Hi, thank you. Well, I'm going to try to be brief because Gruto and our president, I think one of the questions people make the most is what is the role of the showrunner? What does the showrunner do? what are the qualities, the skill a showrunner needs to have. And I think we will have a very final, definite answer in this amazing, wonderful masterclass we will have in sequence. Have a great masterclass, Maíra, Guto, great mediation for you guys. Thank you, thank you.
Uma coisa só que eu vou falar assim.
One thing that I'd like to say is,
Ele vai falar pra caramba, vocês vão ver coisas incríveis. A gente precisa de perguntas.
we need also, of course, Jeff will say amazing things. He has lots of experience, but we also would like you to ask. And please make your questions, send us questions, okay, guys? Several questions. Yes, we like interaction. Please interaction with us, especially with Jeff. It's a great opportunity that we are having here along with our partners. We have selected some words to say to you also, and also on behalf of Abra and our other partners. As Rafa said, Brazil has this question in its mind now: what is the showrunner? And it's very interesting in understanding what it is, how it works, what is this role. And we deal with situations that are unimaginable in places where the showrunner is very well consolidated. So when the showrunner was aggregated into our lexicology here in Brazil, they wanted to leave it as showrunner and not translate it like we translate other roles. So what is the role of the showrunner? So we Brazilians, and all institutions in Brazil that advocate, defend the rights, the copyrights of Brazilian writers, we are very interested in discussing that too, because it is a way of making the market very professional and providing security and expanding creativity by well defining this role here in Brazil. So the showrunner should always be the person that is skilled to be a showrunner. That's something we advocate. An author, an international showrunner role is something that is seen in Brazil in general as something that could be bad for Brazilian television, for example. And for now, the showrunner is still a king or a queen. So is the showrunner a king or a queen? Does it generate copyrights? Does it generate jobs? And is it possible to be showrunner without being a writer? That's a very important question also. And to answer this question, all of the questions, we have invited Jeff. But before that, we'd like to invite Katrina Wood, who is representing, she is the CEO, founder since the 19th of Media Exchange, to start our talk also with us about, she represents an institution that is worried not only with the term showrunner that we're going to deal with in details, but also to foster and value and deal with the market and with writers regarding these new terms and other questions that we may have to deal with. So please, Katrina, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me to be back again this year to be with you to talk about the role of the showrunner, which I hope I won't be duplicating too much in what I say, but Jeff will be the final word anyway. So I was introduced, I'm the CEO of Media Exchange, which is an international consultancy with offices in London and Los Angeles. We have a 30-year history of supporting the entertainment industry to develop their creative and business interests in the international marketplace. We're here today to talk about showrunning and the role of the showrunner, which is really a title from the American industry, where showrunners are really the heart of a TV show with immense responsibilities, both creative and managerial. So the US has really managed to industrialize the creative process through their creative principles, which enables them to run returning drama shows in a streamlined and sustainable way. Until recently, shows were running 20 episode runs in 1 year, which is like doing 20 films in a year. Hugely impressive creative and production achievement, the equivalent of running a company with a $50 million budget. The result of this, long history of writing and producing is a big pool of professional writers and producers, a great asset to the local industry. To introduce others interested in this process to the showrunner role, including some of your colleagues from Brazil, Media Exchange has run a program for 23 years now, I think, quite a long time, bringing in people to listen to the showrunners, and this whole process has been exported by starting with a Dane who came with us 4 times to refine what he could apply back home in Denmark, which then became the One Vision approach, which resulted in the Scandi Noir hits you are all familiar with, The Killing, Borgen, The Bridge, but it's sort of a hybrid of the American showrunner role, which brings together the writer, the broadcast executive, and the director. So there's a sort of triumvirate that brings this One Vision together. So that is another interesting hybrid. So we'll be going back to running this week physically in Los Angeles, March 2022. During COVID, we moved to do our training and consultancy online. We have now run sessions of 8 showrunners from the US, adding new players from around the world 4 times over the last 18 months. So many showrunners exposed to the world beyond the States. Currently, we're doing a training of writers and producers from across the world for Netflix, starting this week with our partner, John York. John is widely considered to be one of the world's leading experts, I guess, in storytelling today, a great teacher of writing, structuring, and developing shows. Another shift for us during the pandemic was the influence of virtual production. To demystify this new paradigm, we're running a summit on the online at the end of this month with some of the leaders in this developing arena where TV and games meet. You can find more detail of our programs and consultancy on our website, obviously, and I invite you to take a look and feel free to send any queries that you would like answered. So not all countries outside of the States have the economy to include the showrunner level in production, but there are hybrids developing from the US model that have been applied around the world, from Korea to Spain to the UK. So today we're lucky to have with us Jeff, who's worked both sides of the Atlantic as a showrunner, and who will be helping us understand the different approaches and what are the component parts of these two systems. Jeff, as was mentioned, is a multi-award-winning writer-producer of over a dozen primetime series, most recently executive producing on season 3 of the BBC's series Killing Eve. Previously, he's worked on Designated Survivor, Alias, Northern Exposure, Hill Street Blues, Remington Steele, just to name a few. He's the founder and chair of the Writers Guild America West Showrunner Training Program. And he's also on the Writer Education Committee. In addition, he's taught at USC, Harvard, and the Sundance Institute. And he was one of the several executive producers featured in the documentary Showrunners. You could not have a better introduction to the role of the showrunner, nor a better guide through the elements that comprise this position. So it's my pleasure to hand you over now to Jeff.
Thank you, Katrina. Hola, estou muito feliz por estar aqui e esse é o fim do meu português. I will be speaking entirely in English. What we're going to do for the first 30 minutes is take you through a slide presentation that I'll narrate, and that should cover a number of the fundamentals of what the showrunning role is. And what's particularly important for this audience is the distinction between what we do in America and what most of the rest of the world does. So without giving too much introduction, let's just plunge into it if we can start. I'm not controlling this, but there's the first slide, which I assume you can see there. So we're talking about the role of the showrunner, and the fact is that it's an evolving landscape. Let's move to próximo slide, por favor. Okay, so this is what we're going to be going over. I assume that the people in the audience can see this bigger than I can. I'm just seeing it as let me see if I can get, if I go into speaker view. Nope, that's not going to help me. Okay, but I know what's on there. What we're going to be talking about is first a clash of cultures about how America contrasts with the rest of the world. Then we'll be talking about the conflicting business models that emerge because of this, which I think you'll be able to identify with and apply your own particular specific circumstances to. Then we'll talk about how people become showrunners in the United States. We'll talk about the definition of what a showrunner does. We'll talk about what I think are the most important 4 words that a showrunner needs to know. We'll talk about how the writer's room works in the United States. Then we'll talk about a rough guideline from an idea to a finished episode in a conventional American series to give you a sense of that model. Then we'll take a very specific look at what that means in the life of a showrunner. Then we'll talk about the context of how things are changing. So we'll start with the foundation and what's the most conventional form of showrunning that evolved, and then talk about how it's changing today, and with a very quick look at the future and how things are evolving. It's funny because when I started with Katrina and Media Exchange talking to her groups years ago, everybody wanted to know how America did things. I think with the way that streaming and other platforms are changing content, Americans have a lot to learn from the rest of the world as well. So it's an interesting period of time. Próximo, por favor. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this talks about the distinction between how things developed in the UK and how things developed in the United States, which leads directly to why we have showrunners and England doesn't in the traditional sense. Mass media, which really began with radio, with Marconi, and at the turn of in the 1800s and 1900s, early 1900s, in England, it was always under government control, and it was funded by the government. The people that were controlling the media had an Oxbridge ethos, people who went to either Oxford or Cambridge, very educated people whose mission they saw as serving the public and determining what was suitable for the public. They have a very weak writers' union. Now, I don't know what it was like back in the early 20th century, but certainly in the Thatcher years, whatever unions existed were weakened very fundamentally. And I know from talking to members of the British Writers Union that it does not have nearly the strength that the US union does. Therefore, the net result of this is the writer under the English system is almost exclusively labor. There's no management role involved. And they don't talk about a showrunner, they talk about a lead writer. And that lead writer is certainly an important position, but as we'll see when we look at an organizational chart, does not hold nearly the power of a showrunner in the United States. By contrast, in the United States, the airwaves were given over to corporate control. There's a fascinating history to it, but in essence, the airwaves were sold and private enterprise became the chief management source of American media. They were there to sell advertising time, and the way you could sell advertising time was by putting on shows that would get people to listen. So the shows were there to sell advertising. Because it was an American private enterprise system, as opposed to a Cambridge, an Oxbridge ethos, it was very much like the Wild West. Or you could think of it as the high seas, pirates on the high seas. Anything kind of goes. The only thing, nothing succeeds like success in the United States. So it was pretty wide open. But in the 1920s and 30s, especially in the 30s, a very strong writers' union grew up. It only established its strength through some very costly and controversial strikes. But the fact is that the Writers Guild, especially the Writers Guild West, we're divided into West and East, is a very powerful union. It's a lot of people sacrificed to create benefits and rights and minimum fees that all of us who are in the Guild today enjoy. Out of this mix, very different mix, the showrunner emerged, and the showrunner is both labor and management. And we'll talk about how a person becomes that in a moment. But essentially, through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, the showrunner became the preeminent figure in American television. Next slide, please. Which led to a certain kind of arrogance, you might say, but a certain attitude, like Mad Max, who tells the besieged encampment in the Mad Max movie, you want to get out of here, you talk to me. And so that's pretty much the way things happened with showrunning. It's the showrunner would propose a series and then run it. If we could go to the next slide, we'll talk about, actually, this is the organizational chart. So this will show you in graphic terms just how very different the writer's role is in Britain. You've got the network in the studio at the very top of this pyramid. You've got your other departments there underneath. And you'll see that in red, that's where the lead writer is, heading up kind of the writer's department. But if you look at where the lines of power go, the lead writer really doesn't have any power of any magnitude. Reports through the producers unit and reports through to the studio and to the network. And the director actually has, in many cases, more influence than the lead writer. This is very simplistic, but it does give you a very strong sense, just in very rough terms, of how things work. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll take a look at the American position. Now you see that red block of the showrunner is on the same level virtually as the studio and the network. And what's really significant is to look who reports through the showrunner, essentially everybody. All the departments, the director, the writers, everybody reports through the showrunner. The showrunner coordinates everything that goes onto the screen. And the reason why I put the showrunner on the same level as the studio and the network, the studio essentially, there's different patterns, but the studio essentially pays for the product and the network pays the studio a fee to put it on the air. This is not strictly how it works in streaming, but that's basically the pattern. So the studio spends money to produce it and usually owns the product, and the network is the one that distributes it. In the case of streaming, the network owns the product as well. But what's significant is essentially they're the money people. They do have something to say about the creative direction of the show, but they don't really command the troops. The troops are commanded by the showrunner. So they have the money, but the showrunner has the troops. Okay, as we go to the next slide, we'll talk about how does somebody become a showrunner in the United States. The traditional method was that you would create your own series. You come up with an idea. You've been working in the business. When I came up in broadcast, they would only let you pitch after you'd been in the business for a while. But you come up with an idea, you pitch it to a studio. The studio agrees to take it to the network. The network agrees to it. You write it. If it's put on the air, you run it. Another method that was particularly popular when I came up in the business in the mid 80s is that there were certain showrunners who, if they had a successful show, a good example would be in the half-hour world. The Mary Tyler Moore Show was very successful, and they spun off a couple shows based on a couple characters that were in that show. Well, other people have to be designated to run those shows, or very often the creator would go to run the spinoff, and then somebody else would be promoted to run the original show. So that's another technique that still exists today. You can still be on a show, and if the creator leaves or is fired, you can be promoted from within. You can take over someone else's show. My first show running job was Picket Fences. David Kelly, the very talented writer-producer, had done it for 3 years, wanted to do other things, and I was coming off a Northern exposure, and he asked if I would like to take over what was pretty much going to be the last year of that show. So that was an opportunity. That's what I would consider in corporate terms a friendly takeover. Most of the time when somebody takes over someone else's show, it would have to be considered in corporate terms an unfriendly takeover. The showrunner has been fired and they want somebody else to take over the show. Usually the cause of somebody being fired is that the scripts are late, the network's unhappy with the scripts, or some combination of that. But very often the inability to get scripts out on time, causing what's known as production shutdowns, costs a lot of money and quickly is followed by announcement of new showrunner. The fourth is something that's come up in the last 10, 15 years in particular. You can be assigned to assist a creator. It used to be, as I said, that the broadcast networks would not allow you to pitch until you'd had plenty of experience. But one of the repercussions of that is by the time you were allowed to pitch, they'd leached all of the creativity out of you. So you only came up with palette variations on existing themes. So they turned appropriately to people who were younger, fresher, not necessarily younger, but certainly fresher and not worn down by the system. The problem is those people didn't know how to run a show. And so people like me who'd had a number of years of experience would sometimes be assigned to a new creator to help them get their show on its feet and through the first couple seasons. Then finally, in today's streaming world, you can be assigned to a package. Netflix is the best example. They'll come up with a piece of intellectual property. They'll come up with a director, perhaps an actor, or some combination of those factors, and then approach you and say, would you like to write this? And while it's still a very important role and you still are nominally the showrunner, because you didn't create the show, because you were approached to be part of a package, you don't quite have the leverage that you would in other circumstances. But it's another legitimate way for somebody to become a showrunner. But it's also an example of how the business is changing. You are becoming more of an employee of the studio than under the traditional broadcast system. So it begins to revert a bit to what movies look like in the 30s and the heydays of the studios. Okay, so that's a brief overview of how people become showrunners. So now let's go to the next slide and we'll take a look at the impossible job. I mean, showrunning is an impossible job to do well every hour of every day. Why? Let's go to the next slide. Because you are responsible for all three phases of production. If we can put up the next, we'll take a look at that. If we can get it to go, there we go. So you're responsible for pre-production, filming, and post-production. And I won't walk down all of those categories, but you can read them for yourself, all that's involved with each one of those. And as showrunner, not only do you hire writers and run the writer's room, you also are in charge of casting. You hire the directors, you work with the directors during prep, and you also have final cut during post. So it's a great job from a creative position, but it tears at you all the time. And it's very difficult to manage your time effectively, which is why if we go to the next slide, the 4 words that I tell people they have to know when they come out of the showrunner training program. The most important thing you have to do as a showrunner is quality scripts on time. And let's take a look at that. Quality scripts. If you're just turning in scripts, but they're not very good, then what are we doing this for? If they're not on time, however, you're compromising the ability of your team to do a good job. Everybody from actors to directors, to camera operators, to prop costumes, you know the problems if you've worked in production. So you need to have both good scripts and deliver them on time to do this job. And as Katrina mentioned, traditionally it was actually 22 episodes a year that we did in broadcast. And there still are 22 episode shows. And sometimes if they're successful, they'll order 25. Back in the 1960s, it was 39 episodes a year. Very different world, but 39. And just one note that's worth, again, in terms of understanding the cultural and social and corporate origins of the showrunner, all of these techniques, all of what I'm about to talk about in terms of the writer's room, all came out of radio. That the pioneers of radio were the ones who figured out how they could generate interesting scripts on a weekly basis. And all of those lessons were incorporated into early television, and they continue to influence television. So it's a fascinating history, but the pioneers of radio are the ones who figured out how to maximize production. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about what the writer's room looks like. I mean, it is a factory floor in a way, but you can produce some pretty good cars on a factory floor. You can produce schlock too, but the goal is to write good scripts on a regular basis. So let's just take a quick look inside the writer's room. I don't quite know how things are done in Brazil, but if we go to the next slide, this will show you what a typical writer's room looks like. It's a conference room with a lot of whiteboards and bulletin boards. There's a lot of candy and other junk on the table, and people meet there, at least before COVID, 6, 7, 8 hours a day sometimes to come up with stuff. Let's take a look at the next slide. When we come up with ideas like this one here, you think about what happened in the episode before, what's going to happen in the episode after, and you begin to trace how you want these stories to develop. If we go to the next slide, this shows in more detail how one particular storyline is being developed. And there's a lot of back and forth in the room, a lot of discussion, but this is the kind of way, there's no magic wand. You just have to work at it, put stuff up, erase it, put other stuff up, and keep fighting until you get something that you're happy with. Next slide. Then once you've done that, in a show like Army Wives, which is what this room was for, where you have ensemble cast, multiple stories, each story got a different color. And so you can see the different colors on the note cards here. And before we put the stories up on the board entirely to try to make a woven hour, I want to make sure that each story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that each story works. Only when we're satisfied that each story works independently do we try to put it together in this structure, what I call the weave. And because of Army Wives was on basic cable, which means it used act breaks, which means that was written in 5 or 6 acts. So you needed to have each act out. You had to know where to put commercials. That's why it's put in those particular columns. So again, moving very quickly through all of this, but what we do is we go back and forth. We try to figure things out. Sometimes when you put stuff up on a board, you discover that one story takes place in 24 hours and another one takes place over 3 days. So you've got to do some push and pull to figure out how are you going to make this fit in 1 hour. But one of the benefits of having multiple storylines is if you had to get to an act out 5 times with one story, you're probably going to torture the logic of the story and just make it very melodramatic. By having 2 other stories to play with, you can end different acts on different storylines. And as you can see, just looking at the bottom of each column, even though the pink storyline is the one that dominates, the first 2 act outs are not from that story. So it was a way to be able to sustain viewer interest by running multiple storylines. Okay, next slide. This is just a look at what happens as we're putting things together. This was the lower right-hand corner of the board, what I would call the swamp. It's a virtue, as you know, if you're a writer, to have more material than you can use. It's hell if you don't have enough. So when we're creating these things and we come up with the different stories, it's a relative pleasure to be able to take cards that you thought you needed and put them down in the swamp. And usually when they went down into the swamp, they do not reemerge. Occasionally they do, but you'll see that there's a handful of scenes there that when push comes to shove, we didn't need. And if you've done editing, once a film is shot, you know also that concision is a virtue and you can get rid of more. So just another example of how things work within the room. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the season as a whole. And as the season progresses, we track each set of characters, both vertically and horizontally. And we want to make sure that all characters are being well served during the course of the season and be able to track things. And sometimes when you're in the middle of trying to plot episode 8, you said, when did we do that other thing? Was that episode 4? Was it episode 5? And you can look at this board and figure it out. Okay, let's move to the next slide. In order to make this work, you need to have a schedule. Now, this is based on the traditional broadcast basic cable model. And I'll just take a moment to explain that. In a 22 episode season, usually, and this is the very standard broadcast schedule, used to be that shows would premiere, and they still do for the most part, in the fall. And you do your 22 episodes, which take you through into usually March or April of the next year. The networks decide in May what shows they're going to renew and what new shows they're going to pick up. So if you're on a returning show, let's say, and you're picked up, you find out in April or May, and the room is reconvened, or if you're a new show, it convenes for the first time in early June. And then they give you a production schedule so that you know when you have to start making these episodes to make the air dates that the network has already determined. And you just back up from there. So usually in a 22 episode season, you want 8 weeks before the first episode preps. And during those 8 weeks, you start by trying to arc out the season in general form, determining what it is you want to do. You spend a few days doing that, and then you start breaking individual episodes. And those episodes get written. You have your team in the room. And if I assign Vanessa to the first script, once that outline has been approved, and she goes off to write the script, and she leaves the room while she writes that script. Then we move on to the next episode, and that could be Guto's episode. And therefore, same thing. He writes the outline. When the outline's approved and he's ready to go to script, he departs and goes to write that. And this continues in hopscotch fashion. And then production begins. And when production begins, you want to have 5 or 6 scripts written. And then you just keep going on this treadmill. And you continue until the end of production, which doesn't happen until March, which is a merry circus, but also gives you the opportunity as a writer to observe pre-production, production, and post. And a good showrunner will expose the staff to all 3 of those areas. So you will see the casting of your episode and have something to say about it. You will perhaps go to location for filming, at least part of it. You will sit in on the editor's room in the editing bay at some point and watch your episode being edited. So you're getting educated in what a showrunner does. You're learning a lot more about how things work. And by being on set and being in post, it really helps your ability to write as well. So that is the traditional model. And if you look at the schedule, you'll see that it's scheduled in a very crisp way. And I won't go into all the details about what each thing represents, but this was John Wells, who is like a showrunner par excellence. And this was his show Shameless. He also was responsible for the last few seasons of West Wing. ER was the show where he really developed a lot of the techniques that he uses here. Anyway, that's the schedule for Shameless. Let's move on. And I'm going to take you very quickly through what a typical schedule is for getting from broadcast, from outline to broadcast. So an idea is broken in 5 to 10 days. So if Maria comes in and says she's got an idea, we start to work with it, and hopefully within 5 to 10 days, we've broken it out in the process that I showed you with the boards. Then the writer has 3 working days to deliver the outline once we've approved it. The showrunner has 2 days to give notes. The room makes suggestions. So if you're on staff, you get a chance to make a comment as we go around the room, and everybody gets a chance to comment. Then the showrunner will determine what revisions will be made. The writer makes those revisions. The outline goes to the studio, gets the notes back from the studio within a couple days, and then the outline goes to the network. Now, I know in talking to UK writers that the idea that the studio gets back in 2 days was laughable to a lot of them, because the studio is so much more important, and so is the BBC or whatever the commissioner is. And they asked me, well, what happens if the studio doesn't get back to you in 2 days? And then I said, well, then we move on. We go ahead and make that show, because that's on the broadcast side, because I'm responsible for making that show. And if they're holding me up, I'm not going to let them hold me up. We have to keep going. So, but again, that's very much old school. Script is the same thing. When the outline comes back approved, the writer then has 10 working days. And by working days, I mean consecutive days to deliver. And when shows fall apart, sometimes scripts are entirely written in 2 or 3 days, but it often shows the strain. I like to give writer at least 10 days. The showrunner then has 3 days to give notes or to make a rewrite. The room makes suggestions. Again, the writer makes the revisions. The script goes to the studio. You get the studio notes. It goes to the network. You get the network notes. So now we've gone from outline to finished script in 18 days. So the running total now is 23. I'm sorry. We didn't go to the next slide yet, did we? I want it on my screen. Yeah. So that's what I just went through, 33 to 38 days. Let's go to the next slide. So now we go into prep, and you have, at least as a showrunner, 2 essential meetings with the director. The concept meeting, which happens on the first day of prep, where you go over all the production needs and questions that the director has. I consider the concept meeting the time for you to listen to the director. Production changes get made to the script. There's casting, there's a production meeting, there's a table read if you have one. Not every show has a table read, which is where the cast sits down at a lunch hour and reads through the entire script. And then before the show is shot, you sit down for a tone meeting, which is the director's chance to really listen to you as you go through the entire script and talk about the intention of every scene and the nuance of every scene and any problems you want to make the director aware of. If certain cast members aren't getting along, or if certain cast members have a tendency to go in a certain direction that you don't like, that's your opportunity to tell the director. So now we've prepped, we're 40 to 45 days. Let's go to the next slide, please. We will get there. So we're in production, and production takes 7 to 8 days. And that's again in the broadcast schedule. In the premium world, in the streaming world and HBO at the top of the game, they could take 18 days to make an episode. But again, in the more factory line approach to broadcast and basic cable, you have 7 or 8 days, depending on what's been scheduled. You go to post-production, you can see all the things the editor has 2 days to deliver a cut to the director after the last day of dailies. The director has 4 days to deliver a cut to you, the showrunner. You have 4 days usually to deliver to the studio. You get studio notes, you incorporate them, you send the revised picture to the network. The network has 2 days to get back. The network can make more demands, but in this rough schedule, let's say they have 2 days, then you lock the picture. When the picture is locked and you've made all of the picture changes you're going to make, then you spot it for music and special effects. If you don't know what that is, I'm not going to stop to necessarily go into it here, but it's your opportunity to indicate where music goes, what extra dialogue may be needed, what special sound effects may be needed. I always sit in for the music spotting because I love TV and movie music, and it's a real chance to help finish the picture. Now, before this, you've temped the picture with plenty of music. You can't send cuts to the studio or network without temp music, or they just don't know how to look at it. So you've already put some music in, but now you're actually spotting it with the composer and indicating precisely what you want. Music and FX are delivered in 6 days. The picture goes to the playback stage. They mix it under 2 days. And in 2 days, at the end of those 2 days, you're brought in as the showrunner. You listen to it on the playback stage. You make notes. They tweak it. And then you deliver it to the network. And there's other things that happen to the picture, but that's essentially the end of your active involvement. So let's go to the next slide and kind of add it up. So we've got idea to finished outline, 15 to 20 days, outline to finished script, 16 to 18 days, prep is 7 days, production is 7 to 8 days, post-production takes usually a month. So the total is 75 to 81 days from the time that Vanessa walked in with her idea to the public being able to see this, potentially being able to see this. It can be done in less time. It can certainly be done in more time, but that's the basis. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see that the struggle is you have to keep doing this. It is a bit like Sisyphus. We keep pushing that stone up the mountain every time. Now, let's take a quick, if I'm doing okay on time, if anybody wants to stop me, I've got probably another, let's keep going. Okay, because I've got about 10 minutes probably to finish. Okay, so let's take a look at what this means on an actual on-the-ground basis with the next slide. We're going to look at a day in the life, thanks to the lads from Liverpool, of what it takes to get through a day. So let's go to the next slide. Each color here represents a different episode. So this is like the second season of a 22-episode show. And we begin with episode 10 shooting. And so they're on location. You're at home, you wake up and you're reading the writer's draft of episode 13. So this is where this multitasking comes in that I'm talking about. So episode 10 is there. You're reading a draft of episode 13, which is 3 ahead of where you're shooting, which isn't bad, but it's not great. You go to the office and you're rewriting episode 12. So now you've worked on 2 episodes. You get a crisis call from the set. The lead actor is having trouble with a line. That shouldn't happen, but occasionally it does. So you cancel your lunch plans. From 9 to 10, you have a concept meeting with the director on episode 11. Remember, we talked about what that is. So that's the next episode up. And without going into details why, in broadcast, usually the first real day of prep with the director is the second day of prep. So that's when we're having it. So it's the second day of shooting of the next show. So you're having the concept meeting with the director. I've only given that an hour, which is probably a little underestimated. From 10 to 11, you give notes to the writer of episode 13, which is the one you began reading. You look at a casting tape for an uncast part on episode 10, because just because that episode is shooting doesn't mean that that you are out of the woods. There's still things that have to go on. From 11 to 11:30, you got a studio notes call on the episode 14 outline. They don't like it. That just is great for your day. Let's go to the next slide. So next, from 11:30 to 12:30, you sit in with the editor for the final notes on the producer's cut of episode 8. So you're about to send that one to the studio. You get a crisis call from the set. They've lost the afternoon location. Now, they're having problems on this episode, probably more than you're used to, but than it's normal, but there it is. From 12:30 to 2, that's where you do your music and sound effects spotting on episode 6. Now, that one's locked, okay, because it's 6, it's 2 before 8. That one's done. All the editing's been done, and now you get to lay in the music. From 2 to 2:30, you get network notes on episode 12, which you've already been rewriting, and they have problems. So you cancel your shrink appointment at that point. From 2:30 to 4, you're in the writer's room, and you're working on episode 15. So the outline. So we're shooting 10, and we're working on 15. So at least we're keeping work going. What's unrealistic about this schedule in some senses is that's only an hour and a half of the showrunner to be in the writer's room. But as long as you have somebody who's keeping the room running, the room is probably running the entire day. You approve a prop design for episode 10. Again, that episode just refuses to let you go. You review episode 14 notes that you've gotten from the network with the writer. Now you get studio notes on the cut of episode 7. That's one we haven't mentioned yet. You sent them that one 2 days ago, and now they've got notes on it. You cancel your dinner plans. From 4:30 to 5, you go over the studio notes on the cut with the editor. Then you ask the studio for breakage for a guest star role. That can be you have a pattern budget, and if you want somebody of a particular status, you might need more money than is in the budget. So you want to ask the studio if they will go over if we can get this certain actor for this part. You continue rewriting episode 12, and you go home to watch dailies of episode 10. You don't have to watch those anymore at work. You can stream them. So let's go to the next slide. And this is it in all. So you see we've got, I think there's 8 episodes here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is a bit exaggerated, but not much. When I talk to showrunners and say, is this the way it feels? All the heads go up and down, because when you're working on a network show, a broadcast show or a basic cable show, even if anything more than 10 episodes feels like this, and even 10 episodes can feel like this. But there's nothing like this multitasking that goes on over the course of a 22 episode season. So let's go to the next slide. This is why a first-time showrunner once said that showrunning is like being beaten to death with your own dreams. You work so hard to get your show on the air, and then this pressure can be incredible. So it's a it can feel like that at times. So we've been talking about pretty much the standard broadcast basic cable approach, where you are shooting, you're writing through production. And like I said, it has a lot of advantages. And one of the advantages is that you can adjust on the fly. You've introduced a character, a minor character, who suddenly you look at dailies and the character takes off. And you think, I'm going to play to that character. I really want to make Rwanda now a major character. So you have the opportunity to do that. Conversely, you might have had high hopes for one character that's not working out. You can write away from that character or play into different strengths. You can't do that if everything's written before production begins. But that's where we're going. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about the importance of context. Let's go to the next slide. These are things you probably are very familiar with, but these are all factors that affect your ability as a showrunner, your job as a showrunner, your effectiveness as a showrunner. What platform are you working on? Is it streaming? Is it cable? If it's cable, is it basic cable or is it subscription cable? The basic difference there is subscription cable doesn't work with act breaks. So in terms of the format of your scripts, it's different. There's also not the discipline, which can be a blessing and a curse, but I think in many cases a blessing of being able to write to a set running time. If you notice on certain HBO and Netflix shows, one episode can run 47 minutes, it can run an hour and 2 minutes. If you know what you're doing, that's great. And I'm no big fan of act breaks. I don't believe that commercials necessarily make anything better. But having a fixed running time, having some discipline, it can be like it's playing tennis with a net. And sometimes not having that discipline is playing tennis without a net. And it shows. Some certain shows get bloated. So is it broadcast? We just talked about that. And there's other formats coming up all the time. What is the writing setup? This is really important. How many episodes are you writing? In broadcast, it's 22. In basic cable, it's still like 12 or 13. And by the way, broadcast is kind of coming back down to 18 or 15. This affects your staff size. How many people can you hire? And that affects what type of room do you have? Is it an all-season room like I've been describing for broadcast? Or is it a mini room, which is the term, it's not a good term. It's not accurate. It makes it sound like it's a small room. That's not necessarily the case. You can have a number of writers in a mini room. What it traditionally defines is a writing staff responsible for breaking the season and assigning all the scripts and then disbanding before production. So it's very much more like a movie in the sense that the script is allegedly written before it's handed over to a director. In reality, we all know that once you get into production, there's going to be changes. And if you're involving directors and actors, there's going to be changes from their direction. But this is what's happening in large part in the business, is that because there's economies of scale when you can do block shooting, and they're asking more for writers to deliver everything before production begins. The only person who's usually retained, or at least originally retained, is the showrunner. And so the poor showrunner is then left to carry the bag into production. And when changes come up, it's only this one person that has to make all the changes. That's changing a little bit, but that's been the problem. The bigger problem is that the next generation of showrunners are not getting exposed to all the elements of prep, filming, and post-production. They're really just getting exposed to the writing process. And as important as that is, you can't be a showrunner without understanding how to run the other aspects of a show. So there's situations in the United States where people have fancy titles and have worked on interesting shows, and then they're given their own show and they've never even edited an episode before. So it's a problem. Then you talk about the production setup. Traditionally, everything was shot in LA. Then remote location shows became more popular, which is that you're headquartered in Los Angeles, but you shoot it somewhere else. Northern Exposure is a good example. We wrote it and edited it in Los Angeles, but it was shot in Washington State, up in the northwestern part of the United States. Army Wives, another show I worked on for 7 years, was shot in South Carolina. And so in Charleston, South Carolina. So these things affect your ability to have hands-on responsibility. Who are your production partners? Traditionally, it was just a studio and a network. Again, the studio is the one who paid for it. But now there's something called a pod, a production overall deal, or a production only deal. These are often former studio or network execs who try to find intellectual property. They'll approach a writer with it, and then together they'll approach a studio. It's another layer of hopefully creative input, but it can also be just another layer of bureaucracy. And then there's the network, and then there can be other partners. And in the international market, if somebody puts money into a show, they might want a place at the table. Let's go to the next slide. So this affects, all of these situations affect who your daily team is. No matter what the show is, your most important partner is your line producer, who keeps you on schedule, on budget, and tells you how to get the maximum from your show. If it's a remote location show, you have a position known as a director producer, who is somebody who often has directed the pilot, but not always. That person will direct several shows there, but will also break in other directors. The way I think of it, especially on a remote location show, is the line producer is your right hand, responsible for everything physical about the production of the show. The director producer is your left hand, responsible for the creative aspects, including cast morale and trying to troubleshoot anything that might be happening on set that you need to know about. Then there's the director of every episode, which is extremely important. You can have a non-writing producer who can be a great asset, but also sometimes can just be somebody who's there as part of a pre-existing deal. It could be the star's manager. It could be somebody from the production overall deal company, which leads to what I consider the non-existent producer, somebody who might have had something to do with getting the show launched, but now is not around at all, but just takes money from above the line. On one show I worked on, believe it or not, between two people from the movie world who helped sell the series and the star's manager, $120,000 an episode went for nothing. These people had nothing to do with the show, but you just take $120,000 off the top before you could even start to make it. And then there's number one on the call sheet, your star. Increasingly, as things get more influenced by the movie world, the influence of stars, they'll get executive producer titles. And in the old days, that used to just be a vanity credit if they got a credit at all. Now, in many cases, they actually want to have input. And it's something that if that's the situation, you have to embrace it. Sandra Oh was an executive producer on season 3 of Killing Eve, and she had a very strong voice, and that was all part of the deal. You know, Sandra was one of the important people that had to be listened to in terms of negotiating where that show was going. And I don't characterize that one way or the other. It's just a fact on the ground. And it's something that's happening more frequently around there. So if I have to look at the future, there are some threats out there. Let's go to the next slide. So we find ourselves, unlike Mad Max, who was supremely confident in that first illustration. Now we've got, we're a bit embattled. You know, on the one side, you have mini rooms and executives who are getting more power, and then there's these directors and monopolies are having more influence on it. It's a frustrating, it's a fascinating time, and believe me, I have great respect for directors and executives too. It's just a question of who is really pulling the strings. And I'm a strong believer that our system has worked so well because somebody with a vision and a drive has been able to actually be at the head of those productions. It is changing, but I think that the best defense against about more intrusion and the only thing, let's go to the last slide. Our best defense is just to do what writers have always done, which is write your best. That's the ticket. And so by sticking to that and writing the best stuff you can in our country, that's the ticket to more authority and more power. And that'll keep, you know, and then the managerial stuff is hugely important, but it begins by creating the shows and creating the stuff that the studios and networks want to put on, so that you can take the attitude, you want to get out of here, you talk to me. And that's the end of my formal presentation. I hope it wasn't too long.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your class tonight.
I'm sweating here.
Learning a lot, even in the short time we had. We have a few questions for you,
Sure.
and I'm going to do that in Portuguese, so I'm sorry for that, but I hope you're well assisted with translated.
We'll see.
Uma primeira pergunta que a gente recebeu.
The first question that we received is regarding the beginning of your presentation, that you made the difference between the US system and the UK system. Thiago Dottori asks, what do you think? Which system works best in your opinion?
Tricky question.
It's yeah. Which question? You know, which system works best? I think that in terms of producing high quality over time, the American system has advantages. I think when you look at British shows that have succeeded, the kind of shows that we consider on the par with the best American shows, you'll see that the writer had more influence than is typical. But I also think that I have to qualify the answer, because the UK products tend to be 6 episodes, 8 episodes, and the approach that's more of the movie approach, in which the writer has less to say about production, can work if you're only doing 6 or 8 episodes. But if you want to continue to produce 12, 14, 16, 22 episodes, the British system just can't sustain it. The studio and the director have, they choke the flow. And I say that respectfully. It's just, if you want to be hand making, if you want director and studio to have, or director or studio and network to be able to parse everything and make decisions on their own about what they think is going to be best, you just can't get the work, because since they're not writing, they're only working with writing you've already handed them. There's a natural limit to how much product you can put out there. And so it's a false dichotomy to say that one produces better quality than the other, because we all know that the best UK shows can stand with anything. But it is to say that on a pound for pound, week in, week out, year in and year out basis, I think the American system produces more quality product than in terms of sheer hours and output than the UK. And also, I mean, there's no question from the writer's point of view, writers are better compensated, writers are better regarded than from a corporate point of view in the United States.
Aqui no Brasil, a gente tem agora, né?
Here in Brazil, now with the platforms and so on, we have formats that are shorter, I would say. But our writing school comes from the soap operas, where productions are gigantic in terms of episodes. So in this sense, I believe that the American system is more sustainable if compared to the UK system, and based also on what we just answered.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to speak to writers and producers at Univision in Mexico City a couple of years ago. And they explained to me, oh yeah, we have shorter orders now. We just got an order for 90, 90 episodes. And I thought, holy cow. And I had such respect for these writers, but I felt so, it was clear, and from talking to them, and I'm not betraying any confidences here, they were really at the beck and call of the studio and the network. I mean, they were pretty much like galley slaves. I mean, it was like they have to produce so much stuff. And also the way it was in Mexico was there were certain stereotypes and they're just archetypes that they were expected to propagate, to continue to do. And that was very frustrating for them as well. But it struck me again, going back to why and how did things originate that way? You have to look at the cultural, corporate, sociological background of how those media institutions developed. And then it's more understandable about how the writers are treated. But, again, I mean, we have soap operas here and they write big Bibles for them and they have people crunch out the scripts every day. But as any writer in the audience will understand, that can only take you so far, and you have to rely on a lot of melodramatic turns to keep things going. And there can be a certain enjoyment to that, but it's not, when you look at the premium end of the business and you look at some of HBO's best shows and Netflix's best shows and some of the best broadcast shows too, it took an individual sensibility and vision to make that work, and often in contrast to what the accepted wisdom is of the conventional programming is. Well, if you have a conventional type of system, they're not going to sponsor something that's subversive to that idea. So it's all intertwined, but yeah.
Uma próxima pergunta.
Next question that we have here for you is regarding from Valcir Santos, the question about this balance between these roles that the showrunner has to carry out. Is it more necessary to be more executive, more managerial, or more creative? In other words, is the managerial side more important than the creative side for a showrunner?
That's a great question, a really important question. I think that any showrunner of any value begins and ends as a writer, but you have to have the managerial skill to keep your show afloat. I like to use an expression from the world of American politics. We have the U.S. Senate and we have the U.S. House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, the Senate, they sit there for 6 years, 6-year terms. The House of Representatives has 2-year terms. And so they're constantly worried about reelection. And there's an expression, which is, before you save the world, you have to save your seat. And that's the way I feel about show running, is that in order for you to get your vision across, you have to demonstrate that you can maintain the authority, maintain the managerial skill. And in terms of the way the American system worked, another way of answering your question is good executives know that most shows fail. Most shows are not huge successes. And so it's possible in our system that you can run a show that is canceled in its first year or only goes for a year or two and is not considered a big success, but you've handled yourself so well. You've managed the show very well. You've dealt with executives and your own people very well, so that when that show goes down, they want to be in business with you again. On the other hand, you can do a show that does pretty well, but you're a jerk and it costs a lot of money and people don't like dealing with you. And you could really hurt yourself. When that show goes off the air, unless it's a big hit, you might find yourself looking for work, because executives want to work with people they think are adults. And again, it's a mistake to characterize executives as the enemy. They're not the enemy. They sometimes act like the enemy, but they're not the enemy. They're very often creative people in their own right who are really trying to do the best that they can in their own corporate structure, but they like dealing with adults. When I started in the business, somebody told me I was going to do really well as a showrunner because I was an adult. And I didn't quite know what that meant until I got more involved with the business. But Hollywood has sometimes been described as high school with money. And it can be that way. So if you can, it's like what Kipling said, if you can keep your head while everybody around you is losing theirs, good things will happen. So again, it's an important question, and the balance goes back and forth. If you had to give more weight to one than the other, it's got to be the writing, because that's what's going to keep the show on the air. But if you can't support it with the managerial skill, unfortunately, the show's going to fail, or you're going to be replaced because you're going to fall behind. And we've seen that happen time and time again. So that is both the promise and the peril of the American system, is how to keep that balance in place. But it's an excellent question, and it's something that every showrunner always has to be thinking about, is balancing those scales.
Jeff, may I ask how exactly the showrunner program training at WGA works? And to complement, Flavia Candida asks if Brazilian creatives can be part of that, writers, producers. Is it possible?
It's not, because technically what happened was the program's going into its 18th year, and about a little more than 20 years ago, maybe almost 24 years ago, a friend of mine and I, who came up in the business together, noticed that a lot of newcomers were not, they were given a chance to do shows. And like I said, they were given the responsibility and they didn't have the knowledge. So we wrote a booklet with a few other writers about what you need to know to survive. And based on that, I said, there should be a program for this. And the Directors Guild has a program that trains assistant directors, an excellent program that a couple friends of mine had gone through. And I thought, why shouldn't we do the same thing for showrunners? And essentially the way it works is it's by application only. We're looking for people that we think are going to be in charge of shows soon, or may already be in charge of shows. So you have to already be a writer-producer or have active development. In other words, a deal where it looks like your show may go. You have to be recommended by a showrunner or an executive. You have to provide 2 recommendations. You have to fill out a couple short, I wouldn't call them essays. There's just a couple questions about your background and why you're interested in the program. Then this is the way it's evolved, we have an admissions committee that reviews the applications. In fact, we're just in the process of doing that now. And we get about 150 to 190 applicants with the way we've raised the bar in terms of qualifications for 30 spots, because we try to keep it as a master class. Then the admissions committee goes over that. We interview about 60 people out of 150 to cut it down to 30. And then we meet for 6 Saturdays in January and February. And it's organized, and each session goes from the doors open at 8:30 and it runs until about 4. And each part of the curriculum is organized on the principle of it goes back to that last question, going from being a writer to a manager. What does that mean? And so the first session is about that, from writer to manager. And we instruct through a number of different techniques. We use panels of people that come in. We have guests, we usually bring in 5 to 8 guest speakers every session, depending on what we're talking about. So the first week is just about that whole challenge of going from being a writer to a manager. And the program's been around long enough that within that first session, we often get a panel of 4 or 5 people who went through the program and talk about what was your biggest misconception, what was your biggest mistake taking over a show or running a show, what's your best piece of advice, and it becomes a very fluid and interactive conversation. Then each week is organized under managing writers in the writing process, managing directors, managing actors, managing executives, managing post, managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a big one that people really interested in is managing work-life balance. That's the other balance that is involved, because it's one thing to be a writer and a manager. It's another thing is how do you stay a human being while also being so involved in this. And people are always interested in hearing how people maintain some sense of home life and sanity doing that. So unfortunately, it's only available to members of the Writers Guild, and you know, we I don't know if we'll expand it beyond that. We do other programs for the membership in general, but I will say that I've just submitted a manuscript called Running the Show, which kind of goes into a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here in more detail. And I'll be sure if it comes published, it gets translated into Portuguese, so we could discuss it further. You know?
You mentioned earlier the sentence, the mantra, quality scripts on time.
Right.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that. The good showrunner exposes the team to all stages of the process. And how is possible to deliver the quality script on time and do that at the same time? So,
well, that's why I titled that slide "The Impossible Job." It's every showrunner tries to answer that in her or his own way, and it's a tremendous challenge. But I think that I mean, everybody tries to answer it in their own way, and I think that I think one of the principles of good management is that you want to help people get where they want to go. If you're part of my team and you want to be a showrunner yourself, I know that that's a motive. You know, I know I can use that motive. You want to do your best possible work, and I want to create an environment in which you can do your best possible work. And so I'm going to give you the opportunity to learn everything you can. But with the understanding is that you first have to, you know, you do your job, what you're expected to do, and the world is open to you. So if you do what we're talking about, I want to make it as, you know, I want to make everything available to you as well. You know, you want to take my job, you're welcome to it. You know, I'd like nothing more than for somebody to come in and be able to take over so I can just collect a paycheck and lean back and do nothing. So I think that's one way to look at it, is that you try to energize people and assume that they want the best for themselves and the best for the show, and you try to make that the same thing. Doing well for yourself is doing well for the show, and when you really want something and you're passionate about it, you can do things you might not have thought are possible. I mean, there's still only 24 hours in a day, so as you say, it's a tough challenge. But you get your writing in and you do it well, then you get to go to set and you get to look in post and so forth. You know, I don't know if that answered your question, but it's. If you ask different showrunners, they would have different. You know, look, not every showrunner is Yoda. You know, there are some showrunners who are just.
But I try to be a one.
Yeah.
Jeff, in your opinion, how do you think the showrunner job changed with the streaming? You talk a little bit about that, but could you expand your?
Yeah, I think, you know, you have to be careful generalizing, because at a place as huge as Netflix, I know people who've had great experiences at Netflix as showrunners and people who've had less than great experiences. I know one friend who did a production with them in Mexico and felt that they were really cheap, and he was the only person getting American wages, and it was really awful. I have other people who've had better experiences. One friend of mine was doing a show and was told by an executive that they rejected a story arena because they said it didn't fit his story cluster. Now that sounded like it came out of somebody from IT, from information technology, and essentially, since that's where Netflix grew, it's not surprising. We all know they use algorithms, and he just had it. That's probably the last show he'll ever run, because he was so disgusted with the idea that some executive looking at an algorithm was telling him what a good idea was and what a good idea wasn't. So it varies. I think that the major point is that if you've come up through more traditional, conventional show running, broadcast and basic cable, you have to be flexible. You have to suss out where's the power deriving from? Who do I have to, if you don't have, it's funny, I talked to Jed Mercurio, you may know that name. Jed is a fabulous UK writer who did Bodyguard and Line of Duty. And he and I did a presentation with several others for the British Writers Guild. And I was surprised, I was appalled to hear him talk about how little respect he got from the BBC, and how he had to kind of not essentially grovel, but work very hard to get shows on the air. And he said, no, that was the way things worked in Britain, that the system wasn't going to let an individual become more important than, the BBC system. That was in essence what he was saying. But he said something I thought was very useful. He said, I try to maximize my influence. And so what I tell showrunners who find themselves in these new environments is you have to exercise influence where you don't have absolute control. Of course, it's folly to think that even the most powerful showrunner has absolute control. We all have bosses. We all have things we have to pay attention to. But relatively speaking, considering that Mad Max paradigm that I used, we are used to a fair amount of swagger in terms of feeling like we're in charge. And when you enter a system as big and as well endowed as Netflix, it can be humbling. And I think that the key is, why are we in this business? We're trying to do a show that we believe in. We want to have a maximum influence over it. So I think that showrunners have to be very nimble. But that's the biggest arena, is that I think that the traditional authority is being impinged upon by directors and by executives, because that is much more the movie model. I give you the script, Guto, and then you say, okay, this is what I want done with it, and let's do this. Whether you're a director or a studio executive, if you have that power, you can say, yeah, Jeff, I don't know, we want this change and that change and stuff, and say, well, now who's calling the shots? And if we're only making 6 or 8 and I walk off, you could probably still find your way through 6 or 8 episodes. If we were doing 16 episodes, you need me more. So those are real world things. And there's all sorts of other issues that have come up with streaming that the Guild is trying to get involved in. But the playing field is changing so rapidly that it's very tough for the Writers Guild, which negotiates a new basic agreement with the studios every 3 years. It's very hard to come up with things that you can define and enforce. The targets keep changing. The good news, because I'm very much an optimist about this stuff and a cheerleader about it, there's never been more good TV at any point than there is now. And as I tell film students, there's a new word for independent cinema. It's called television. And if you really want to make something worthwhile about real people, and it doesn't need Marvel's universe of heroes, TV is the place to do it. So that's all great. So we all have to take these considerations. You have to take that into consideration, that we're working in a great period of time creatively. But first of all, when have writers ever been happy? We're never happy. We're always complaining. So we have to find, but the conditions that have given rise to the fact that, just one other thing is that movies, since the breakup of the studios in the 50s, in the late 40s and 50s, movies have been the director's medium. The director is the straw that stirs the drink. In radio and in television, it's always been a producer's medium. And in the last 30 to 40 years, it's become a writer-producer's medium. And though that distinction is really the key battleground, is it still a writer-producer's medium, or is it going to become more of a director's medium? And it's not going to be either or, and it's not going to happen overnight. There's just too much product, too much platform. But again, I put my faith in the fact that the writing is so important that if they make it too unpleasant for the best writers to work under these circumstances, then they'll have to change. But it's fascinating,
I have to agree with that.
Go, Ma. Go. É você, Ma.
We have so many more questions for you, but we are now running on the time, and I think your last question answered a lot of one of them. So I'm going to move to the last question, and we can end this great conversation we had. I can be a showrunner and not deal with money. Is a question for Bianca Watson.
Is it, can you be a showrunner and not deal with the money? Is that it?
Yeah.
Well, the one thing is that being a showrunner, you're not responsible for raising the money. That's, so in that sense, you're not producing in the sense that you're responsible for finding the investors. But in terms of dealing with money, again, in this book, I've just submitted the manuscript to my book agent. In talking about the budget, budgets do terrify writers. There's no question. People think that you need an advanced degree in economics to understand a budget. It's not really true. When it comes down to it, at least in the traditional broadcast and basic cable method, let me just talk about that. You have a pattern budget. You have a certain amount of allowance that you can spend every episode. And an American 1-hour TV show, now that budget could be $4.5 million an episode. So when Katrina was talking about you're in charge of a $50 million corporation, if you have a 22 episode order for a show that costs $4 million an episode, you're talking more closer to 100 million, $85 to $100 million that you're playing with. Now that can be daunting, but let's take a look at that $4 million budget. Out of that $4 million, if you really analyze it with your line producer, and that's one of the things you learn to do as a showrunner, is find allies, find people who can break it down for you, and to whom you can confess your ignorance, and you can get information. But out of that $4 million, maybe 400,000 is really under your control, is discretionary. A lot of that budget is assigned to infrastructure, standing sets, teamsters, things that you, cameras, all sorts of stuff that you don't really get to play with. The levers that you get to play with are things that as a writer, you already understand. If you're budgeted for a regular cast of 5 people and you put in 10 guest stars, you can expect to be over budget in cast. If you've written in a police funeral at night with 100 uniformed officers in the rain, you've just added not just personnel, you've added costumes, special effects, water, night. You're going to be over budget. So the most of what understanding budget is having a good line producer who tells you after you've submitted a script, you're so much over budget in terms of the broadcast model, you're so many days over and you're so many dollars over. And you can even be on schedule, but still be over depending on what it is you're spending on. And then you say, well, where are we over and why are we over? And then you begin to work out solutions. It's what I call horse trading. Okay, what if we move this scene, or if I cut that scene, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do that? And actually, it's that kind of discipline that sometimes builds a better script. I'll give one example. A friend of mine, Matt Nix, did a show called Burn Notice that was set in Miami. And he had a scene, his line producer talks about this. He had a scene where people were running through the snowy woods at night. Okay, now this is a show that's shot in Miami, and for whatever reason, they needed this running through the woods, snowy woods at night. So the line producer said, okay, tell me what's most important about this scene. Is it the running? Is it the night? Is it the woods? Is it the snow? Tell me. And it turned out that the least important aspect was the running. He said, okay, we can on a soundstage, we can get by building a little bit of a woods with snow and make that scene work. And they did. So that's a good example of where a line producer might throw up their hands and say, we can't possibly do this. We'll say, well, let's rethink as a writer what it is that you need to do. And that kind of trade-off is really one of the, it can be a headache, but it can be one of the great satisfactions of being a showrunner, is seeing how you can get a script to satisfy what you want and make it fit into that budget. And sometimes what emerges when you realize you can't do what you originally wanted, it might even be better through that kind of discipline. So,
may I ask a little curiosity? Who was the best showrunner you ever witnessed working in your entire life? aside from you.
I don't think this is a very good question to do.
I've worked with a lot of really good showrunners, and they all had different strengths and weaknesses. Although I must say that, my career, it began on Remington Steele with a great boss. He taught me more about writing and how to behave in terms of generally, but he wasn't a classic showrunner in the sense that the line producer did everything, but he was a great model. Then I went to Hill Street Blues, which was a great show in its last season, and let's just say it was not so well run in its last season. And then I did 4 years of development, and I produced a number of pilots, but they didn't get picked up to series. Then I went to Northern Exposure, and that was the last show that I had a showrunner on, because I've run every show I've worked on since. And Josh Brand ran that show in the first few years. And then David Chase of The Sopranos came in with another team who was there to run it for the back half. Josh Brand was just brilliant. And there were certain things managerially when it came to dealing with actors and things that he didn't really want to deal with, but he was the most brilliant showrunner I've worked with in terms of story. But I'll end by saying that there's two types of shows and showrunners. There's teaching hospitals and private hospitals. And a teaching hospital, that's what I had in my first job. Michael Gleason would take us on the rounds as a chief resident. We could look at the patients. He would let us treat the patients, but he wouldn't let us kill anybody. That's what a good teaching hospital does. A private hospital is you come in and they expect you to be able to do the neurosurgery. And if you can't, the patient dies and you're fired. And that's the way that Josh Brand ran Northern Exposure. I could go into more detail, but I mean, I was 30 when I joined the staff of Remington Steele, and I had a lot to learn. I was 40 when I joined the staff of Northern Exposure, and I learned a lot there too. Very different, and I would not have been ready for Northern Exposure a day earlier than I arrived.
Thank you. That's a beautiful end.
All right. Where are you guys? What part of Brazil are you in?
Aren't we, Maíra?
I just want to know when I come visit if I can come see you guys.
You can come. We can sing Tom Jobim for you when you come here.
All right, excellent.
But please come to the Carnaval. You have to be here.
Minha alma canta, vejo Rio de Janeiro.
Rosa Passos.
Yeah, Rosa Passos, yeah.
So Jeff, thank you very much for having this conversation with us. I'm sure everyone here that listen to you are extremely grateful for all this class we had. So thank you again in the name of BR Lab.
Well, thank you, and I'm only sorry I didn't have a chance to meet everybody, but
you will come in person. You meet everyone in Rio and São Paulo.
All right. Well, good luck to everybody.
Good luck to you, Jeff. Thank you very much. It was really a masterclass.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Tchau.
Tchau, obrigada, audiência. Obrigada a todos.